Good evening all, and welcome. Being followed home is an uncomfortable sensation. Knowing that someone is on your trail, that they'll know where you'll live, that they could do anything they want with this information, and all the fear that comes along with it. I hope you're ready, because it's time to get uncomfortable, arm your home alarms, and let the darkness take control. My family lives in a small town in central Minnesota, and things like this hardly ever happen here. It was a startling surprise. Anyway, last night my mother and my grandma decided to go shopping at a Target in a nearby town for groceries and a couple of other things for my grandmother's house. They pulled into the parking lot, entered the store and began shopping. Pretty normal night shopping so far. My grandma and mum usually shop separately, so they grabbed carts and went off in their own directions. This is when things got a little weird. My mum and grandma both noticed this rather strange man wearing a tan t-shirt and bland jeans, aimlessly walking the empty aisles of Target, seemingly with no objective. My mum had noticed him a few times at that point, always in the same aisle as her, and each time he had been throwing small glances at her, trying really hard to be inconspicuous, but failing. He would just stand there, throw glances at her, whilst pretending to browse the shelves. My mum was starting to get a little creeped out at this point, but tried to brush it off. Mum moved on to another aisle to look for Gatorade cases, and happened to lose him for a bit. My mother, now feeling a little better because the man was nowhere to be found, picked up some Gatorade, threw it in the cart, and glanced at her list once more. Just as she was about to move on to the chips aisle, she received an ominous call from my grandma. Evidently, after my mum left the aisle the man was in, my grandma noticed the same man speed walking down the center aisle of the grocery section, looking down each aisle for my mum, turning his head wildly in every direction. My grandma told her to be careful, and my mum agreed and hung up to hurry up and finish her shopping. As they were finishing up, my mum went over to the cards shelf and looked at a few things. As she was doing this, the man seemed to appear out of nowhere, and my mum nearly plowed him over with her cart. She quickly apologized, but as soon as she saw his face, she made a beeline for the checkout 50 meters away where my grandma was waiting. My mum and grandma checked out together, hearts pounding as the man walked up right behind them in the checkout line, a little too close for comfort. The man was apparently hunched over, his head concealed as he was facing away from them, taking notes or something with a small notepad, while looking at every one of them once in a while. My mum began to feel sick from fear at this point, and as soon as they paid, they took off quickly out the door to my mum's large SUV. The man was buying 2 small glass cups, giving them time to run off as he checked out himself. Unfortunately, my mum and grandma had only just begun to unload their groceries into the SUV when he came out staring them down. He strode over to his white Ford Escape, which was parked just across the lot from my mum, and got into it, holding his shopping bag with the 2 cups. Now my mum and grandma were frantic. They basically threw the remainder of the groceries into the back of the SUV and took off, trying to lose the man. Sure enough, he followed. My mum was still not completely sure what to do, and drove off the normal route to the highway, where she decided to try something. At the junction to the highway that leads to our hometown, instead of continuing straight on the current road, my mum abruptly slammed on the brakes and turned right onto the highway towards our town, pedal to the metal. Mum regrets doing this because the man from Target did the exact same thing. The distance my mum put between her and the man was quickly closed when he caught up to her, tailgating her SUV incredibly closely. At this point, my mum was freaking out, her knees shaking. They were only 5 miles from home at that point, and were out in the middle of nowhere, not knowing what to do. She continued accelerating up to 90 miles per hour to try and put more distance between them, and sure enough, he did the same and caught up again. After what seemed like a whole day, they finally reached town. At the first stoplight, my mother slammed on her brakes and took a hard right onto the first road in town. The man, not expecting this, continued on. My mum, thinking this was all over, pulled into the McDonald's just off the road and took a few breaths before going back on the road. She turned onto a frontage road and headed towards our home, now only 1 mile away, but nearly had a heart attack when she noticed a pair of headlights belonging to an ever-familiar white Ford Escape turning onto the same frontage road from the next street up. The man must have turned right at the next lane. My mum told me herself it was like time suddenly slowed down as they passed each other. Upon seeing my mum's SUV, the man slammed on his brakes in the middle of the road and made an illegal U-turn to get back on her tail, and my mum was nearly crying. She made another abrupt right turn without signaling on the road that the police station was located on, hoping to lose him. She pulled into the brightly lit police station parking lot and just sat there for a while. The man must have noticed the building she was parked in front of, because he just continued on and parked in the parking lot of an adjacent apartment building and sat there watching her to see her next move. Regretfully, my mum didn't call 911 at this point, mainly because she was frozen with fear. My mum and grandma probably stayed parked at the police station for at least half hour, until the man left and drove off. They didn't leave the police station for at least 15 minutes after that. They never saw the white Escape after this. My mum dropped my grandma off at her house and then drove back home to ours and got no sleep that night. The next morning, my mum called the police and filed a report. They took his description along with his car and said that they would get back to her. Fast forward to Sunday morning. My mum received a call while enjoying Mother's Day drinks with Grandma at our house. It was the sheriff. And apparently he had some news on this stalker. Apparently, he lived in a town 45 minutes southeast of ours in an apartment. He is the real kicker. The apartment hadn't been occupied for at least 3 months. We really don't know where to go from here. The man could literally be anywhere, and that has been freaking the whole family out. We don't know if he somehow found out our address, and the sheriff just told my mum that they would keep watch on our neighborhood for the next few days and told her to call 911 immediately if she sees anything out of place. This event really shook my mum and grandma up, and my dad has been in a near shaking rage over the last 2 days because of it. I just hope we never have to meet that crazed guy. I'm currently a 24-year-old female, and all of this happened 3 years ago. I live in a very small town. Like if you sneezed while driving on the highway, you'd miss half of it. In this town, it's pretty much the picture of everyone knows everyone. Because of this, I've been walking around on my own since I was in middle school, and I've never felt unsafe. On this day, I had just been at my boyfriend's family's shop, uptown, which was about 4 blocks or so from my house. I'd been speaking with him and his mother, helping out a bit in the shop, and then headed home. My boyfriend and I didn't live together yet. I still resided with my grandmother and brother. When I was about a street away from my house, a car pulled up beside me, and it was a guy named Ben who I've known for a long time. He was a year younger than I, and his older brother was in my grade at school, so I've known him and considered him a friend since we were little. He had 2 girls in the car with him, one I knew called Carly, and one I didn't. Ben asked where I was going, so I said, going home. So then he offered to drive me. I'd like to pause and point out that he was driving in the opposite direction away from my house. His grandfather and uncle live across the street from me, and he knows exactly where I live, and has been to my house multiple times to help out with small chores like shoveling snow and trimming a hedge, so he definitely knew I was almost home. Ben would have had to drive all the way around the block to take me home, and I was literally one street away from it, and I could see my house from where I was standing, so I politely declined, and said it would only take me a few more minutes to walk there. He then offered again, but insisted, "Can I give you a ride?" It had changed to, "Just get in the car," and I started getting weird vibes, so I declined again, thanked him for the offer, and wished him a good afternoon, and started walking. He then put his car in reverse and backed down the street, following me and matching my pace. Now I hear him say something to the effect of, "Don't just walk off, get in the car now." I've gotten rides with friends before. I've even ridden with Ben in a car that mutual friends were driving, because it was 100 degrees out and I had to walk to the square, and they passed by me as I was leaving the house. I do have a car and a license, but I'm pretty much broke and don't like to use gas if I can help it. So I walk a lot. Not to mention the fact that outside one or two locations, anywhere I need to go in the town is less than a 30-minute walk from my house. As I've said, very small town. I've accepted rides from friends before when it was pouring with rain or freezing cold, or if I had armfuls of groceries from the dollar store down the road from me. And once, for a week or two, I rode with friends to school or co-workers to work because my car got totaled in a collision. Thankfully, everyone was fine in that. But on this day, it was a breezy and beautiful summer's day. I had no groceries and with not a cloud in the sky and my front door just ahead of me. But yet Ben was insisting and even demanding that I enter his car. At this point, Carly, who was in the back seat, was looking a little uncomfortable, and she looked like she was just going to try and get him to keep driving. The girl in the front, who I didn't know, was laughing, and looking back on it, she may or may not have been high. I kept telling Ben that I was fine, and I was less than 10 yards from my front door, but he kept insisting, swearing at me, and telling me to get in the car or else. Luckily, a truck drove up, and Ben had to drive away because he had pulled into the wrong side to talk to me and was blocking the road. I ran the rest of the way home, and messaged my boyfriend everything that just happened from the safety of my bedroom. I didn't tell my grandma just then because she was napping, and I didn't want to wake her. Now, remember how I'd said I'd been at their shop about 4 blocks away? Well, my boyfriend was at my front door in about 5. He, like me, does not drive. He ran the entire way, wanting to make sure I was okay since, apparently, Ben had some issues in the past that I was not aware of. I met him at our front door and told him again everything that happened. I kid you not. We stood on my front lawn talking. I looked up the street I had just walked down and saw the car, Ben's car, pull up the 4-way stop there facing my street. And he just sat there for a few minutes. No blinkers on, no indication of moving. Then without signaling, he made a turn and vanished. Just a few minutes later, he appeared on the opposite end of my street, cruising very slowly, right past the empty lot next to my house. I was really freaking out, and then he showed up on the turnoff directly across the street from my front lawn and pulled up in front of me and my boyfriend. My boyfriend put himself between us as Ben rolled down his window and started saying he wanted to speak to me. The 2 girls were still with him, and now Carly looked really uncomfortable, but I wasn't saying anything. The other one was still grinning and laughing. My boyfriend was yelling at Ben to back off and leave me alone. Ben was yelling that he wasn't doing anything to me, and I had moved from freaked out to full-on scared. My boyfriend was demanding why he was circling the house, and Ben claimed he hadn't been doing that. Now my grandma called me back inside because her phone was ringing, and it woke her up. I go in and Carly is calling from inside the car. For some reason, instead of rolling down the window and talking to me, she called my home phone to explain to me that Ben was just picking up a friend who lived down the turnoff, and he wasn't circling our place. She said this, even though there was no one new in the car with them. So who were they picking up? I hung up, went back outside where my boyfriend and Ben were still having a shouting match, and eventually it culminated with Ben driving off. My boyfriend stuck around for a while to keep an eye out, but then needed to return to the shop to help his mother, as he'd run out and left her running it alone, only stopping long enough to say I needed help. He told me to call if Ben returned, and to ring the cops if necessary. Literally not 20 minutes after my boyfriend left, Ben pulled up in front of my house again, but this time the girls were gone. It was just him. He knocked at my door and I was genuinely terrified that I hid where he couldn't see me through the door, and my grandma answered. Now, my grandma raised 6 kids, including me and my brother. She worked retail, had been a single mother, and dealt with all manner of assholes, and does not take crap from anyone. And this is a literal tank when it comes to kids. So the instant she pulled the door open, she started screaming at him that if he didn't leave me the hell alone, she was going to call the police, as well as tell everyone in his family, as again we lived across from his granddad and uncle, what he was doing to me. He started spouting some excuse about how it was only a joke and he was just kidding around. He also kept insisting he wanted to talk to me and asked her to let me outside to talk. I was still hiding at this point in tears and shaking, and my grandma tore into him, telling him she didn't care if it was just a joke. He was stalking me, had threatened me, and harassed me by continuing to come to our home, and if he didn't get off our property in the next 60 seconds, the police would be arriving at his place very shortly. He then left, but for the next month or more, I was terrified of running into him alone again. If I went anywhere, I had someone come with me, and I didn't walk anywhere for weeks. I found out later that he had shown up at my boyfriend's mum's shop later that day, but my boyfriend and his brother had yelled him out. I'm not sure if maybe he thought I'd be there, or if he was just trying to convince them it was just a joke. About a year after all this happened, I ran into Ben while I was out, and he gave me an apology for scaring me, insisting he'd only been joking and I overreacted. I, being a bit of a pushover, decided to accept his apology, but I let him know that he had severely damaged my trust in him, and that he should never expect me to go or be anywhere alone with him again. He accepted that, and now years later, I've seen him a few different times in public places, and exchanged pleasantries with him before making an exit, and mostly when my boyfriend was present. Things got somewhat resolved between them as well, but my boyfriend made sure to let him know if he ever did something like that again, he would regret it. And to this day I've never gone or stayed anywhere with Ben where it was just him and me. Anytime I run into him on a quiet street, I say a quick hello and keep walking. This has made me very wary. I'll always be looking over my shoulder to make sure he isn't there. So to the friend who followed me home, let's not meet again. The creepiest moment of my life so far may be tame compared to some of the stuff that you've heard before, but it was still scary nonetheless. Right. Every Saturday, me and a few friends get together to watch UFC. We live in England, so this usually means staying up until the early hours of the morning, followed by a painfully tiring walk home after it's finished. I live on the other side of town to my friends, so whenever we watch it at one of their houses, I have to walk a good 6 to 7 miles to get home, as I can't afford a car. This was never a problem though, because I don't mind walking as long as I've got a bit of music to keep me company. And I was still a naive 17-year-old who thought everyone in my area was friendly and harmless. Needless to say, I was proven wrong. September last year, we were watching UFC. I remember it was John Jones versus Rampage because I lost a substantial amount of money on a bet when Rampage got completely dominated. The event went on until around 3 a.m., at which point we all parted ways and set off home. I had made this walk countless times and considered my chosen route perfectly safe, although looking back, it was probably the worst route I could have taken. I basically followed the main road for a mile, and this led to some back alley which led to a 5-mile home straight, consisting of a high road to my right and Forest Park to my left. In the day, the park was really inviting, as it was just swings, slides, and a climbing frame, completely surrounded by a wall of trees. It was like something straight out of Center Parks. However, at night time, with the lack of light, it's a stereotypical, almost Scooby-Doo-like creepy place. I had made it to the home straight without interruption, and everything was going as normal. I remember I was listening to Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles at the time. I was about 2 miles down the road and just coming up to the dreaded playground when I felt a car coming up behind me with its high beams on. It wasn't uncommon for cars to pass me on my walks home. Minicabs frequently passed me, but it was unusual for their lights to be that bright. I thought nothing of it at first, but the lights stayed on me for way longer than they should have. All I was thinking was, how has this car not overtaken me yet? I took out my headphones and I heard the engine running really slowly, like when you pull a car out a drive. It was at this point I realized the car was literally right behind me. The driver must have seen me notice him because he sped up, so he was going at the exact same as me. Being naive, I thought he probably just wanted directions or something, so I stopped to see what he wanted. As I stopped, so did he. I took out my other headphone and said something along the lines of, "Hey, what's up?" He didn't say anything but just stared at me. He looked like he was in his mid-40s and not of English descent. My best guess was that he was Polish, due to his greyish-white hair, big build, and scruffy appearance. No offense to Polish people, by the way. That's just how a bunch of Polish people that I personally know look like in my area. His blank stare kind of freaked me out, so I just stuck my headphones back and started walking fast down the road. This was far from the end, however, as he again matched my speed, staring at me the whole time, not once looking at the road. As soon as he caught my eye, he gestured me with the "come hither" motion, which accompanied his now grinning face that really freaked me out. I was genuinely panicking at this point and started weighing up my limited options. I could try to run home, but this would mean running in a straight line for 4 miles, which I probably couldn't do for a start. And he would be able to drive alongside me the whole way. So that was a no. I could attempt the freak-out method and try to act crazy to scare him off, but I had already shown signs of fear, so doing this would probably result in a physical confrontation. I can take care of myself just fine in a fair fight, but this guy could have any assortment of weaponry, so that option was a definite no. In the end, I had to go for my third and final option of dart into the forest and hide until he drives away. As much as I didn't want to do it, I jumped over the small ditch between the path and the forest and proceeded to hide in a big jumble of bushes 20 meters in. At this point, my heart was in my throat, and I just sat there staring at the road, waiting for the lights from the cars to disappear. I must have sat there for what felt like an eternity, but it was in fact just a few minutes. But the lights didn't go away. All I could do was plead that the car drove off, and after several more minutes of the lights just staying there, I realized I had to plan another way of getting home, or at least away, and I figured the only way was to make the rest of the way through the forest. But I couldn't move. I was genuinely paralyzed with fear. It took me a minute to compose myself, and then I gradually started shuffling forwards. I didn't care how long it took. I just had to get home. I edged forwards gradually and eventually reached the clearing where the park was. I didn't want to be out in the open, so I was trying to think of the best way to get around the park. It was only then I noticed a black silhouette sitting on the swing with its back to me. It could only be him. He must have gotten out of the car to look for me and was just waiting on a swing. Tears were streaming down my face because I was sure that it was him. Once again, I found myself paralyzed with fear. He hadn't seen me, and I don't think he had heard me either. But the sickening feeling was in my stomach, and he just sat there rocking back and forth. I took a deep breath and then sprinted as fast as I could back the way I came, back through the forest, and came out on the edge of the road where the home straight had started. I say sprinted, but I felt like one of those dreams where your legs don't work properly, and they just shake and wobble uncontrollably. From there, I ran all the way back to my friend's house. I don't remember much about the journey at all. It felt like 1 second I was in the forest, and the next, I was banging on his door and shaking uncontrollably. He let me in, and his parents called the police, who arrived about an hour or so later. I went to the station to make a report and give a description of the guy, but they never took it any further because my description didn't match anyone of known danger in the area. When my parents found out, they insisted that it be taken further, but the police seemed to think that nothing illegal actually happened, which is fair enough. I guess there's no way of knowing what his true intentions were, but as far as I'm concerned, I thought it was near the end for me that night. It goes without saying that I never walked home at that time of night again, and now I'm a hell of a lot more paranoid when it comes to strangers. I live in an extremely quiet neighborhood, one that's considered safer than most of the ones surrounding it. One Sunday morning I woke up abruptly early and decided it'd be nice to go for a walk. I live in a very foggy place, so of course there was a lot of mist swirling around. Still, it seemed like a fairly ordinary morning. I ended up walking for about 15 minutes when I noticed that there was literally no one else out on the streets, including cars driving by. My neighborhood is very quiet, and it was super early in the morning, so I thought nothing of it. I'm not really one for walks, as it was very out of character for me to even go for one in the first place, so I opted to turn around and head back home. After a few minutes of walking, I heard the light crackling of gravel behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a disgruntled old man on a bright red bike pedaling in the fog around 20 feet behind me. Thinking nothing of it, I turned forward again and kept walking, assuming that his biking would be faster than my walking and he would pass me. Another minute passed and I turned around in confusion, wondering why the hell he still hadn't overtaken me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized he was now just 10 feet away, biking at the same speed I was walking. Slightly creeped out now, I decided to just pull over to a bench on the sidewalk and take out my phone to let him pass me by. My heart was beating super fast as he slowly pulled in front of me, but to my relief, he continued to pass, or so I thought. As I got up from the bench, I realized he had simply pulled over at another bench, 10 feet down the sidewalk in front of me, and stationed his bike there. I was hoping he'd go into the nearby building, but he simply stood there staring out into space. Now I was panicking. I sat back down and began texting my friend to tell her what was happening, in the hopes that he'd get back on his bike and pedal away. When I looked back up, He was now 5 feet away from me, still staring off into space. I put my phone up to my ear to pretend like I was speaking to someone, and then I got up from the bench and fast walked past him, back towards my apartment. I half expected him to grab me, but fortunately he let me pass. At this point, I was walking as fast as possible without breaking into a jog, with my phone in my ear. I glanced back again, sure that it was all in my head and he'd be sitting on the bench, but instead found that he had gotten back onto his bike and began to pursue me. Fully creeped out now, I gave up on walking and jogged through an abandoned parking lot that would lead me to a row of restaurants. The man, completely expressionless, kept following me, a bit faster now to match my pace. The parking lot was surrounded by 2 massive warehouse buildings covering it, more or less from the street view. I was sure this was where he was going, to suddenly speed up and brutally finish me. I made my way to the under end of the parking lot and to the street corner to the restaurants visible just across the way. The "no walking" sign was lit up, and for some reason I decided to obey it, even though there were no cars around. At this point, the man was seriously pedaling towards me, so I finally gave in and dashed across to the restaurants. None of them were open, but one had staff inside. Panting, I stood outside the restaurant, making sure I was within their sight. The man on the bike stood across the street, where I had just been moments before, staring at me. I honestly waited 10 minutes for him to give up and leave, but he didn't move the entire time. Finally, for a split second, he looked away, and I dashed around the corner of the building out of sight. I sprinted all the way back, making sure to take any twists and turns so he wouldn't be able to find me, just by pedaling quickly. I know it may not seem that creepy to some, and that I could have handled the situation better, but I was so shaken in the moment that all of my actions were the first thing to pop into my mind. About a month after that incident, I exited my apartment, which is at the bottom of an extremely steep hill, to head to my Uber. I'd pretty much forgotten about what had happened, but I just happened to look up to the top of the hill, and the same old man was standing at the top, this time without his bike, staring down at me. I got into my Uber and drove away. It's been about a week since then and I haven't seen him since, but I constantly feel like he's gonna pop out and maybe unlock my apartment door and do who knows what. I'm a female college freshman in my 2nd semester. This happened around the middle of my 1st semester, when I was unfamiliar with the area around my campus. My friends and I were working on projects after a long day of classes, and it was about 11 p.m. Amanda was really stressed about a project we had, since we were in the same class, and she began to cry. After calming her down, we all decided to grab some McDonald's and take a break, which wouldn't be too hard since our campus was in the middle of the city. The McDonald's that was closest to us was closed, but Brad saw on his phone that there was a 24-hour one a mere 20-minute walk away. Around 7 of us opted to go there, included Amanda and Brad. About 10 minutes into our walk, we realized that we were in an area we hadn't been in before. No problem, it didn't look bad, and there were 7 of us. There weren't too many strangers about as it was quite late. And when we walked, we made sure no one was alone. At one point though, I had walked a little bit ahead of everyone else and had turned around to wait for the others. To my left, I noticed a white car had suddenly pulled over to where I was. It wasn't like the person had known they were going to pull over. It was like out of the blue. Weird, I thought. The person in the white car never rolled down their window nor opened their door, but as my friends passed, it pulled away. Where the car had pulled over, we had to cross the street and began walking along next to the road after crossing. I glanced behind me and I saw the white car again, pulling up next to us. Then I realized that to get where we were going from, where the car had been before, they had to have made a U-turn, so it was obvious it was done intentionally. They roll down the window as we keep walking, and it's an older man, but due to the darkness, I never got a good look at his face. He neither said nor did anything, just stared. We just tell him to leave us alone. He was obviously staring at me. I began to get scared, anxiety rising in my chest. This guy was after me and was targeting me, and I had never been in a situation like this before. I was from a small town where walking after dark was a thing preteens could do without fear. After we pass, his car pulls away again and leaves. At this point, Amanda is walking behind everyone in a protective manner, and Brad is walking to my left so that I'm not near the road. A minute or two later, the white car returns after doing a further U-turn. At this point, he rolls down his window and begins to speak with me and shows me money, probably to try to get me to go into his car. That is what he obviously wanted. He kept gesturing me to get in, and I was just frozen. This guy could be armed. Who knew what he would be capable of? Most of my friends didn't really know what to say, just telling him to piss off, until Amanda, who had been walking behind me, begins to scream at him. Amanda had been raised in the area and obviously knew how to deal with people like this. She yelled at him, telling him to piss off, and that she would fight him if he stepped out the car. It wasn't her words that scared him off, but the attention she was bringing to the situation. He bolted after Amanda made a scene, and Brad gave me his sweatshirt to tie around my waist, as I was wearing shorts and a crop top, which is probably what drew him to me in the first place. During this last encounter, when he was speeding off, Charlie grabbed a picture of this guy's plates. After that situation, we ended up in an even worse area, the kind of area with heroin needles littering the ground, but we didn't have the same kind of issues that we did before. Though I was still quite shaken up and scared of what had happened, I just wanted to go. We got to the McDonald's and found out they weren't even taking customers inside, only drive-through orders. So our goal basically fell flat, and we got harassment instead of chicken nuggets. We took 2 lifts back to our dorm, my group deciding to get cookies on the way back since the restaurant was a place we had known before and trusted. I haven't experienced anything like that or since, and haven't been in that area since, but I still feel a little bit of fear constrict me when I see a white car passing me a bit too slowly on the street, and when I'm in a city area I don't know well. So weirdo in the white car, let's not meet again. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was naive 22-year-old. I had been downtown drinking at a bar, catching up with old friends from high school, when the pub closed for the night, and we went back to a friend's apartment. We had a few drinks, and before we knew it, it was 4 a.m. She offered me a place on the couch, but I had to waitress at 4 the next day, so I wanted to be home and do some errands before work. I thought I grabbed a $20 bill for a cab fare in case, but it turns out I only grabbed a $5, so opted for the bus. She lived about a 15 to 20 minute walk from the closest bus stop that I needed, so I left her place and began making my way. I was well aware of the dangers of this choice, but being a very young, naive girl, I assumed it would turn out okay, since I had been in similar situations before. I called my boyfriend at the time, and that possibly could have been a decision that saved my life that night. As I'm walking over this detour bridge downtown, I was telling my boyfriend, "It's going really well. I haven't seen a single person since I started walking." Shortly after I said that, I hear footsteps running. I look up to the part of the bridge that I was walking on and paused. Mid-run, directly in front of me, was this guy staring right into my eyes. He was panting slightly from the running. He didn't look like he was drunk, but his eyes were so wide, and I'll never forget that image for the rest of my life. I kept walking, trying to keep as calm as possible. I loudly say to my boyfriend what had just happened, and describe his physical appearance as best I can, and as loudly as I could, and told him my location. I also said, if I stop talking to you for even 30 seconds, call the police and tell them everything I just told you. I decided to look back to see if he was following me, and sure enough, off to the side of the path I was on under a street light, he was there, a completely black silhouette that was this guy, standing stiff as a board facing me. I thought my heart was already racing, but that sight nearly gave me a heart attack. I walked faster, and after a minute I looked back over my shoulder, and he was in the exact same pose, just closer now, and under a different light post. At this point I had two options: continue on the path I was on, or make a run for it under this underpass that was extremely well lit. So I ran. I've been playing soccer and track all through high school, so I had some advantage. As I was in the underpass, I heard him sprint. I remember thinking, if you look back now, it could slow you down, but at least you'd know if he's following you or not. So I looked. I looked in time to witness him sprint past the lit area I was in. No time to rest, because I assumed he was looking to head me off somewhere, so I kept running until I reached a very busy and populated bus stop. As I was resting, from 3 to 4 blocks away, I saw him walking and look around everywhere, I assume looking for me. I got home and immediately called the cops, and one finally showed up to my apartment at 8 a.m. He took a statement, but there wasn't much they could do other than watch the area and keep his physical description in their database. The scariest part when I look back, over the whole course of the ordeal, I never saw him move until I made a run for it. It was like he was some kind of mannequin. So creepy late night stalker, let's not meet again. I was at a graduation party when I was 18. That lasted late, but not too late. I drove home, and I live in a small area that's not uncommon for all the parking spots to be full, and everyone to be asleep in my street that late. I was the only car I saw on my way home. When I pulled up, I parked in front of our driveway, as if I were blocking it, and saw ahead at the intersection at the end of the block. There was a car stopped at the stop sign, facing my block, idling. I knew a girl I went to school with who lived in the house next to where the car was stopped, so figured they were just waiting at the stop sign for her, as there were no parking spots free. I'm also a super cautious person, and always think people are following me. So I was going to wait in my car until the car left, but I noticed my phone had died on the way home. It was my first cell phone, and car chargers weren't huge in my family until this. Usually I'd call my brother, who was a year younger than me, to come out and walk with me inside, but I couldn't do that. I waited for 10 minutes, and the car didn't move. It was switched on, the lights were on, and I was freaking out. I finally got the nerve to just get out the car and run. My house was right there, and I positioned my keys so that I could just unlock the door as quickly as possible. As soon as my door opened, I took a step out the car, and my car light went out when the car across the intersection floored it. I heard the tires squeak and everything. The car was clearly waiting for me to make a move. I saw it pull up and waited till I got out. I don't even know how it happened, but I managed to pull myself back into the car, turn on the car, and reverse out the spot that I had parallel parked in, and pull out, just as the back passenger window of this car met my window. Everything was tinted. I missed the driver window trying to leave, so I didn't see anything of who it could have been. Once I was driving again, I was sobbing. My phone was out of charge, and I didn't know what to do. I considered going back to the party, but eventually I just circled my blocks enough times that I was able to connect every car in the area with my neighbors, so I felt comfortable enough to go back home. I had never run out of my house so quickly in my life. My mum worked nights as a nurse, so I didn't bother waking my brother or stepdad up. I charged my phone, called my mum sobbing, and she was so upset, she screamed at my stepdad, whose car I was driving, for not having a car charger. Which was not the problem, but I see Mama Bear trying to control whatever she could. To this day, 7 years later, if I'm driving at night, I tell my mum when I'm home. It's such a safe town, and I've never heard of anything like this happening since. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's stories, certainly some spooky ones indeed. I don't think I've ever been followed home, but I think the sensation would definitely be unnerving, more so if you're on foot. I think it would definitely be a creepy one. If anything like this has ever happened to you, or something spooky that's happened that you'd like to share, you can find the relevant info in the description. The names of the wonderful people you can see on screen are the amazing patrons who really help me out by contributing a small amount every month in exchange for awesome rewards. If this is something you think you'd be interested in, you can find the link in the description too, to patreon.com, where all the info is there. Thank you to everyone who considers it, and to anyone who signs up. It really means a lot. Thanks, guys. But with that being said, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome. Please stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.